Okay, hello from Mochizuki in Nagano, Japan, and welcome to the Fubon Forum. My name is Roger McDonald. I'm the director of Fenberger House, which is a small house museum and workshop center in Mochizuki in Nagano. I'm also one of the founding members of Arts Initiative Tokyo, which we founded almost 20 years ago. I've been an independent curator. I've taught at art universities for many years, been a writer. And my background is actually not fully in art. As you can see on the screen, I studied religious studies for some years before specializing for my PhD in the relationship between religious experience and modern art. So I come from perhaps a slightly unique area within the study of art history. And this has informed my current thinking and my current work as a curator and as a teacher. So today I'd like to share with you some recent work that I've been doing here in Nagano mainly. Some of the workshops I organize, and some of the historical and backgrounds and contexts which kind of informs my thinking about this work. So in the first part, I'll talk a little about these contexts, the history, and then I'll go on to introduce some of my actual practice as a teacher, as a workshop leader, and then finish with some thoughts on how the role of art is, I think, changing quite rapidly in our quite disrupted world. So let me just get straight into it. So just to talk a little about some of the ideas and contexts which are really informing my thinking at the moment relating to art and learning and art and workshops. And for me, I think art is a very, very powerful technology that can assist us in becoming resilient, in becoming psychologically strong at times of great crisis. And of course, I think we are sharing a period of global crises, particularly with the pandemic of COVID-19, but also I think other socioeconomic issues. Climate crisis is, of course, a major issue. And all of these crises and disruptions are changing the way we live. They're putting great pressure on our resources. And, you know, I've been thinking about how the arts, with an S, I think, not just visual art, but how the arts in general have over time been a really important tool for us to gain psychological resilience and become stronger, to be able to sort of survive these periods of disruption. Almost as guiding posts or navigation tools, I think, that art can be to help us. And I think it does this in many ways, but maybe it's interesting to go back and think about what the etymology, the root of certain words are. So if we think about an artist, today's world, we think about an artist primarily as a professional visual artist. But if we go back to, you know, the Greek roots of these words, there is a very interesting term called tekne, which points to someone who makes something or does something. Someone basically with some kind of skill which can be shared in a community to actually do and practice something. And I think, you know, the idea of an artist really comes out of this tradition. So if we broaden the idea of what an artist is, which I think is useful to do in this day and age, perhaps cooks and nurses and doctors and farmers are also artists in a very specific way. They have specific skills and techniques to make and do something in our social situation, like an artist. Likewise, if we think about the roots of the word curator, it comes from the Latin curare, which has a meaning of to take care of something, or maybe to attend to something. So again, the roots of the word curator really points to what the artist Anna Halprin perhaps is doing in this photograph, getting close to someone and trying to attend to their needs, to listen to what is necessary in this time. So it's interesting, I think, to think about these sort of very old ways that art has been thought about. Another thing I often think about is how, when we study art today, we tend to focus on the individual artist as the real focus of art and museums. But I often think about how behind every individual artist, perhaps there is a much more large, we can even say a cosmic awareness of what is happening in the universe, what is happening in nature. And I think this is an interesting kind of position to think about or rethink about in the 21st century. So we can shift from an individualist perspective to a more cosmic perspective, which encompasses the earth, animals, beings apart from us. And how is art informed by this larger awareness or this larger cosmic consciousness? This is the term which a psychologist called Richard Morris Buck came up with in 1901. In terms of actual practical ways that the arts have helped us during times of crisis, there is a rich history. I'll introduce just a few cases here, but this is the example from the Second World War in the UK, where the UK government of the time set up a specific council to use museums and artists and musicians to somehow help or encourage the population through a very tough critical period. So museums were opened for free. There were lunchtime concerts during the day. Free lunches were served at the National Gallery. And I think this period of the war and crisis really sort of made museum directors and curators and artists rethink the notion of what art can do when a society, when a culture is under a great deal of stress. So the Second World War is a very interesting example of how museums and art adapted, we can say, to crises. Psychological resilience, I think, is one really important thing that we can learn from the arts. From a very old and traditional perspective, maybe even just looking at a picture, just looking at a sculpture for an extended period of time, we can call this deep looking or even meditation. I mean, this maybe goes back even to the roots of all art out of a religious or a ritualistic setting, where people would perhaps engage with an object, an artwork, for an extended period of time. A picture here is showing a full moon meditation, which is happening within a Buddhist sect in Japan. Artists in the 20th century have also explored this idea. William Burroughs, Brian Gysin, in the 1950s and 60s, developed a machine called the Dream Machine, which was in a sense a meditation machine. You look at light spinning and it would change your brainwaves and make you calm, perhaps. And you would see visions within your closed eyelids. Musicians have also explored this area. The American composer Robert Rich has made sleep concerts where the viewer actually falls asleep during Robert's concert. So the idea is that he would manipulate your dreams and your unconscious rather than you being awake to listen to music. A completely different understanding and approach to how music is shared in a society. The American painter Mark Rothko built a special chapel just to house his large paintings, which should be seen in a very contemplative, a meditative mode. This is, again, quite a different model to how perhaps the Contemporary Art Museum is thought about as a place of consumption or as a place of tourist destination. Many artists have really deeply explored these ideas through healing of the individual and of the group, of the collective. The artist Anna Halprin, who is 100 years old this year, I had the good pleasure to attend one of her workshops in America. Anna is a really wonderful artist, one of the most amazing artists I have ever met. And for many years, she's really been working primarily with movement, with dance, with the body, as a very deep well of healing of the individual, of the planet, of communities. Very, very interesting work. Brazilian artists like Ligia Clark from the 1950s and 60s, also developing very, very unique, idiosyncratic therapies, almost, using the body, using weights and different textures and colors and smells to somehow awaken our subjectivity, to reawaken our humanness in a sense. I think the idea of somehow re-engaging with a collective, with a group feeling. Art is often a very solitary, it's thought to be a very solitary, individualistic pursuit. I'm showing here a very famous New York DJ called David Mancuso, who started a series of parties in his loft in New York in the 1970s. Mancuso had a very, very interesting also philosophy about what a dance space could be. It's a collective space of great energy, of great vibrancy, of people coming together from different sexualities, different races, different classes. And it's where maybe we could even get a glimpse of a different kind of world. The British music producer and musician Brian Eno also had a very, very interesting approach to this. In the 1990s, he had an idea of setting up civic recovery centers, which I think is a wonderful term. Places in the cities, in the towns, where maybe modern, busy people could recover a sense of becoming quiet, could recover a sense of psychological equilibrium, become sort of balanced again. And Lamont Young, an American artist, and his partner also doing similar experiments through the 1960s and 70s and 80s, using music as a very primary and powerful medium to affect how we feel, to affect our psychological beings. So out of these sort of histories and contexts, which I'm very interested in and I research, in 2014, I founded and opened Fenberger House, which you see a picture of there. It's in a forest in Nagano. Nagano is full of mountains, and it's almost in the very middle of Honshu Island in Japan. So it's surrounded by quite high mountains, 2,000-meter high mountains. The air is very clean, and it's a very good place to hold residential type workshops, which is what I'm primarily interested in doing for the last few years. So I'll introduce some of these workshops and the ideas behind them. Within Fenberger House, in fact, just at the start of this year, we erected a dome structure to hold group workshops. So this is based on Buckminster Fuller's design of a geodesic dome. It comes as a kit, like a tent that you can put together. And I think a dome is a really wonderful architecture, which symbolizes a great metaphor for coming together in the round. Again, this is something which our ancestors perhaps have been doing for millennia, gathering in circles. And the dome is a wonderful architecture which really facilitates this kind of round engagement. So at Fenberger House, we've put on all kinds of workshops. This is a full moon ritual workshop where during the full moon, we asked a local artist to come and lead a group of participants in a very specific kind of ritual, which we did. We have done workshops on deep looking, which I talked about a little earlier, about how we can engage or attend to specific works of art, not just as a scanned, fleeting experience, but as something very deeply engaged with. What kind of time space do we create when we engage with a work of art for a long period of time? We have done workshops based on some of Anna Halprin's wonderful movement ritual techniques and dance techniques. These are not really dance in the sense of a performance, but dance much more as a healing, as a body work kind of practice. So small groups of people would come together and perform specific kinds of movements together. Also, we've used certain works by the Brazilian artist Ligia Clark, tried to recreate as best we can some of her healing works. People are blindfolded, and one person lies on the floor as a patient, and all sorts of different objects from the natural and not natural world are placed on top of the patient. So these workshops are all happening as a residential situation. So people would spend one night or two nights eating together, talking together, and then we spend the day doing these different kinds of workshop sessions. Often we are using our hands to actually make sculptural objects. And also I think a very important element of a lot of my practice as a teacher and a curator recently has been around the idea of expanding what we think of as art. I think this is something which most people think about. You know, what is art? Where does it end? Is it a very expansive concept? And I'm very much influenced by my professor here, a person called Roger Cardinal, who in 1972, he wrote a book called Outsider Art. So I learned a great deal from Roger about art made by people with mental or physical disabilities. Broadly, this is called art brut or outsider art. And I think in most cultures, there are workshops specifically for people with disabilities to come and express themselves either through visual art or through movement or music. So I've been quite interested in working with outsider artists. And this is quite a large exhibition I curated in Tokyo in 2017 called the Museum of Together. And we did a whole series of educational programs for people with, for instance, visual disabilities, hearing disabilities. So we really had to stretch our imaginations to think about how we would accommodate, how can different people access an art space, you know, so somewhere which only had stairs, we actually negotiated with the building to say, you know, could we actually build a temporary ramp so that people with a wheelchair or mothers with a baby cart can actually come up and discover the whole space. So working with outsider art generally, it really forces us to expand how we think about the access of art, how we think about how we speak about art, how we share art, which is a very visual experience, but some people who have a poor visual ability, we have to really rethink how we explain a visual piece of art. So this is another very interesting and I think important area to think about. And recently I'm working very much with the community that I live in Mochizuki. I live in a small town called Mochizuki, which has a very rich history of farming and organic farming. And particularly, I'm involved in a climate change action initiative. So there's a group of maybe 6 of us who live in this town who've come together, and we're very interested to see how we can actually engage with this very important and abstract global crisis called the climate change crisis, but at our local level. So how can we really think about this in our living everyday lives? So I have done talks in the local community hall, where actually, as you can see, many people came from across the generations. So I think this was something very interesting and important to me, to have not just young people, but grandfathers and grandmothers who've lived here for many years, and they have a very unique set of skills about growing vegetables, about making baskets out of straw, or, you know, they have skills which are slowly being lost. And I think we can learn a lot from their experiences, their life experience. So this is something I'm involved in at the moment. So, you know, some of the things I've introduced, and I'd like to sort of finish by maybe just trying to introduce some of my own personal ideas of what role can the arts play in our current predicament, which is the Corona era, or perhaps the post-Corona era. I think it's still very much a present term. But in my own mind, I'm thinking not only of Corona and COVID-19, but also some of these bigger issues, which I think we really have to deal with, like climate change, like socioeconomic disparities, like refugees and immigration. I think these are all intricately connected, and it's making our world in many ways quite tense and quite difficult for many, many people. So in this situation, what can the arts do? What can a museum do? What can a curator, an artist do? Or how can we rethink what we do? So I've just put 6 things which for me, through my own practice living in Mochizuki and dealing with workshops and the local community, I think are quite important. One is a re-emphasis on local community, I think, forming very supportive networks or ecologies within a community group. So I think this is particularly relevant in the COVID era, when we all had to self-isolate and basically live in a very closed kind of space for a few months. And maybe and this sort of thinking has to continue for some time, but I think it's a good thing. We have virtual technologies and internet, but at the same time, I think the focus on the community immediately around us, maybe a space of maybe 20 to 30 kilometers, we could say, is really important. And how do we engage with the elderly people living in our community, with the children living in our community, with the nature in our community? So this is, for me, something which has really been important. I think there's a re-emphasis on the affective power of the arts. So by affective, I mean how arts can directly affect our bodies and our feelings and our emotions. So this is what I mean by affective. Through things like workshops, through healing sessions, through things like just looking very deeply at a painting. I think these are all ways that the arts can have a very, very direct and powerful effect on our bodies and our minds and our psychological situation, and also how we live in a community. So that's something which I am thinking about. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I think there is maybe a re-emphasis on a collective or a cosmic art experience, and not only an individualistic art experience. So this, for me, really comes through when we engage with things like rituals and with dance and with movement, what Anna Halprin or Ligia Clark were doing. I think dance and the body are very, very powerful mediums that can connect us back to a kind of something much larger than just me, just my ego, or just myself. It kind of can expand and dissolve a sense of just everything being connected to me. And I think this is something which the arts generally in our period, in our time, must grapple with again. These are all connected, and I think a re-emphasis on duration and time, a deep commitment to looking again at works of art. I think this is something which is perhaps naturally emerging again during these COVID times. And the role of the curator or the artist, indeed, the museum, the role of the museum in somehow encouraging or how do we encourage people? How do we create the situations in our galleries and in our museums for people to actually engage with works of art at deeper levels? Of course, I think there is a great joy to be had in looking at art at a very joyful and quick way, but I think there's a different kind of joy and pleasure that comes from a deeper looking, from time spent and duration. Maybe a re-emphasis on what I call living arts, not art as a sort of privileged space, just about the fine arts, just about certain communities, just about museums. I think my understanding of an arts which is living really comes out of a tradition of arts and crafts. In Japan, we have Minge, the Minge folk arts movement. There are a whole bunch of historical examples going back 100 and more years, I think, that are very interested in looking at arts as very much embedded within our life world, embedded within the social and cultural and economic and medical situation that we are in. So it's not something which is special, which should be put in a museum or a gallery. For me, I think the arts can be also something very much living in our daily lives. And for me here, crafts, for instance, and outsider art, which I mentioned a bit earlier, outsider art, crafts, very much come out of this tradition. And I think that there's a great deal we can learn from what the crafts and dance and outsider art can contribute to this thinking. And finally, I think a re-emphasis on really thinking together again, sharing experiences and ideas. We can call them empathic spaces, empathy, the feeling of going into another person's shoes to see from their perspective. This kind of skill or method, I think, will become very, very important in the 21st century during these Corona period, I think. So I think the arts, particularly through workshops, learning, group work, can have a great impact on how we sort of come together to share experiences, to share ideas in a very meaningful way, not just as a sort of Facebook post or an Instagram post, but something perhaps using our bodies much more, using drawing as a medium, using sound, light. I think the arts here bring in a whole palette of different kinds of mediums and techniques, which are very, very interesting and useful for people living through these sort of difficult times. So I think I've spoken for about 30 minutes and I'd like to maybe wrap up there, but I hope I've given you some things to think about through some historical examples, some examples of my own practice here in Nagano, and also how I see the current difficulties of COVID-19 and climate and economics and a whole host of other issues really impacting our lives today, and how the arts can perhaps be one sort of guiding navigational tool within this situation. And for this to happen, I think we really need to re-look at the history of art, at the history of the arts. And we can learn a great deal from artists and certain museum curators and practitioners through the 20th century and beyond. There's a great deal to relearn, I think, from history, but also a great deal that's going on with new technologies and new sort of approaches of learning. So it's a very interesting and exciting, I think, area to be thinking about, particularly from my perspective, which is coming more as a workshop teacher and as an educator. So I hope you found it interesting, and I'd like to thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.